Well, haven't done this in a while. Well, how have you all been? That was a rhetorical question, by the way. Actually, when people ask me, how are you doing, or how have I been in the American culture, I always get a bit, maybe not annoyed. I've gotten used to it by now, but I've always felt some kind of cultural disconnect whenever I had to respond to these. Because the established protocol is I'm supposed to say, oh, not much, how about you? And then they respond, not much. But if things are actually going on with me, uh, even if it's small, I, I find it weird that I say not much. So I've had many awkward encounters where people ask me, how have I been doing? And I respond with how I have been doing when they're not actually looking for an answer. They're just looking for me to say not much or everything's good, right? So the call to action for this video, I think typically in my so-called podcasts, I have a call to action. It's usually related to the subject of the topic, but in this video, the call to action is instead of saying, how are you doing? Just say, I hope you're doing well. Don't actually do it. You know, these are all just established protocols in American English, informal American English maybe. But it would be nice if we can all just say, I hope you're doing well, or something of that sort. But anyway, let's get back to the actual topic of the video, which is on Monarch points. So I think Monarch points are really contentious. It is a really contentious topic in EU4, and I think it's getting increased sort of scrutiny as the EU5 development is ongoing. I believe, I could be wrong. Johan has mentioned that there will be no Monarch points or something of that sort. I think I read it in an old dev diary, but I could be totally wrong, or things might have changed, so don't you dare cite me on what I just said, because I could totally be wrong. But I think it's good to talk about it, because a prevailing thought within the community is that Monarch points are bad and that they should be removed. While I don't necessarily disagree with some parts of that statement, I think it's very important to scrutinize this. At least if you care about the direction of EU5 or even EU4. I personally don't care, but I like these kinds of thought experiments and discussions. So I want to sort of entertain myself and maybe entertain people. Or maybe not. Maybe I'll annoy people. Who knows? But as I did a bit of research, and when I say a bit, I really mean a bit, I encountered this post in the Steam community as a response to Imperator Rome removing Monarch points. And I think this really puts my overall feelings on this whole topic well. And so I figured I'd just share it. I suppose I should read it for everyone. Or maybe you have all read it while I was yapping for 3 minutes earlier. But I'll read it. So I just read his original tweet, and he basically asked if they should persevere or not with covering up the illusion of depth using Monarch points. When he should be asking, do you prefer abstract resources or simulated interconnected systems that is influenced strategically by player and AI decisions? You can't just turn the system off and be happy with the results, because it's not necessarily the mana itself, but the choices in game design that relying on mana brings forth. Mana is a way to not have to represent complicated systems. Having something cost money or time isn't going to fix shallow features that were designed without any strategic depth in mind. So I read this part of this comment, and I think that really puts my feelings on Monarch points well. But let me make this 1 minute read aloud much longer, because I'll go in depth, or maybe repeat the same thing multiple times. Who knows? We'll see. So, as I mentioned, I think Monarch points are sort of... Actually, I'm not sure if I should rate MP or mana. I'll rate mana. I think mana is a very controversial topic in Paradox games, and in the context with EU4, there are definitely a lot of vocal people who think mana should be removed, and that it has no place in EU5. Okay. Now, my claim is removing mana in its technical terms makes no sense. That's my claim. And my other claim is that people don't really have a problem with mana, okay? So I'll rate no problems with mana. And I'll put this in quotes and even underline mana, because I want to clarify what I mean by this. I think instead people have problems with content creep and modifier stacking. And certain interactions that involve mana. I think people have problems with these. Now, does that mean they have problems with mana? I wouldn't say so, because if you replace mana with any other currency in the game, like money, I think you'll get the same exact kind of concern. Okay? And I did mention that's a controversial topic. And of course, there's the other side, which thinks mana is fine, etc. And if you want my personal opinion on it, I'm sorry, you're gonna get it's okay. It's okay, as it currently is. But there's a big disclaimer. Okay, the disclaimer is that I am very easy to please. So me thinking it's okay doesn't necessarily mean too much. But it's also a testament to how little intuition I have of video game development, because I have some ideas in mind that we could change with Monarch points, but it's not all obvious to me how that actually affects gameplay for me without actually doing it. So that's why I don't have a strong opinion, because I don't know. So the first thing I'm going to do is expand on this idea that removing mana makes no sense, and how you can replace this mana with anything, with a lot of things rather. And the way I'm going to do that is talking about currency. Okay? Maybe also resources. So EU4, one way to view EU4 is just a bunch of resources that, and alongside conversion factors between resources. These conversion factors might take time, so you can either model time as a resource, or you can have some kind of transformation that's parametrized by the amount of time it costs to enact that action or exchange. So what I mean by this is we can start with money, okay? Or ducats. We can all agree that this is a currency. It's also a resource. You trade money for some kind of effect in game. The effect might not be instant. For example, if you try to build a building, you don't immediately get the benefits of the building right away, right? You have to wait for the building to finish. If you hire an advisor, there's an immediate premium you have to pay to hire the advisor, and then an upkeep cost that costs less than that initial premium. And so money is a resource that we all seem to accept as a very reasonable resource to have in a game like EU4. But one has to realize that money is an abstraction. But Lambda, we had money back in the days. True, but it's not like every single country in the world used a European notion of ducats, right? There's still an abstraction going on because we're sort of agnostic to exchange rates. We're agnostic to any kind of price changes aside from event-driven ones and the very primitive and somewhat flawed model of inflation that we have. So you're really sort of abstracting a lot about money to arrive at the EU4 notion of money or ducats. Okay? So this is important. It's an abstraction. It's an abstraction of some real life thing, right? If we look at manpower, okay, again, you can think of manpower as some kind of abstraction because it makes no sense if you really think about it that you can, if you have like two provinces, it makes no sense that you can sort of hire all your units here, right? Because presumably this part is contributing manpower and the whole logistics behind moving men and even the practicality of it is kind of forgotten. So again, manpower is an abstraction. Now, this isn't a bad thing, okay? I want to assert that abstraction isn't a bad thing. Because if you model too much, okay, then things could get tedious, more complex without much value, strategic value, and so on. So people have decided, and when I say people, I mean the original developers of EU4, EU3, or whatever influenced our current system, have decided that this level of abstraction, the current system of EU4 ducats, is a good enough abstraction of money, of the concept of money. We're not going to model exchange rate. We're not going to model, more complex market changes and so on. Okay. Here's another currency. Reform progress. The thing that lets you buy government reforms or change government reform tiers. Oops. So this is somehow supposed to abstract or model like some kind of like bureaucratic cost. I'm lagging a bit, so I'm gonna reconnect in a sec. It somehow models the bureaucratic cost involved in like restructuring government institutions. Maybe that's one way to frame it. And I think this is where mana fits in well. It similarly is supposed to model bureaucratic costs related to admin dip mill, for whatever this means. This is going to be a criticism I have of the current system. But we'll skip ahead and continue with this thought experiment for fun. This is mostly for fun. But you can even argue that aggressive expansion is a resource, at least at the point where you care about coalitions. So I add a caveat, if you care about coalitions. So this one you kind of have to view at an inverse. You have to kind of invert the thing because instead of AE, think about the allowed AE. So you start with 50 allowed AE on every country, right? Until you get 50 AE, you have no issues with it, at least in terms of coalitions. Of course, you'll affect relations, which might matter in other ways, like forming alliances or being able to hit the 190 relations for diplo-vassalization and so on. But every time you conquer a province and you accrue AE, you're kind of paying this allowed AE. Like say I get 30 AE on a nation, well now I have 20 AE on said nation, right? Now I let 1 year tick, and suppose I have 0% improved relations, I'll get 22 allowed AE, right? I sort of gain my allowed AE at 2 per year at base, modified by improved relations. So, yeah, you can kind of think of it like that. Every time you conquer a province, you're paying this hypothetical allowed AE modifier to every single nation, depending on modifiers like religion of the province, religion of the nation that loses, culture of the province, distance, and so on. And if you will, you can even think of idea slots as a resource, right? You get one at key techs, key admin techs, and that's all you get, right? You only get one per every so admin techs. So if you think about mana, going back to mana, you can kind of ignore this part. This part is just me going on cruise control with this whole direction of currency or resources. But if you think of mana as a currency or a resource that models some kind of bureaucratic cost related to administration, diplomacy, and military, then anything that costs mana, so I like to think of it as a mana sink, anything that uses mana, somehow is an abstraction of the costs associated with whatever that action is, like development. Increasing dev costs some kind of these bureaucratic costs, and coring costs admin. If you're over the diplo relation cap, you somehow strain the amount of diplomatic bureaucracy you can do, or something like that. So when we say get rid of mana, okay, what we really mean is we're going to take every single conversion that involves mana, conversion or action, and you have two options, okay? You can either remove that conversion entirely. For example, if you just totally remove the ability to dev push, that's one way to handle it. And another way to handle it is you redistribute the costs to some other currency. Let me write resource. I think I like resource more. Okay. For example, again with the whole development example, instead of Monarch points, it now costs money and manpower, and maybe time. Or you completely rework the conversion. And here the possibilities are endless, you know. You can make development organically grow over time from other factors. And sort of introduce new ways to interact with development. And so I think when people say get rid of mana, and when they say it as a action, they really mean this, with a caveat that these reworks must be good. Okay, there's no guarantee that the rework will achieve a better system. Ideally it does, of course, but you can kind of see, if you were previously in the get rid of mana 5-head camp, you can kind of see that it's far more complex than that, at least from my perspective. I'm not a game developer. Maybe for a game developer, it's a super trivial task, although I doubt it, given how little strategy games exist that are perfect. I don't think there are any, actually. So, let's see. So I did mention that I will still criticize the whole point of mana. I have a few criticisms of it, okay? So here I'm going to criticize mana as a currency, conceptually. Not even going to talk about how mana actually works in EU4 in practice yet. But of all these kinds of currencies that I've talked about, mana and maybe the government reform progress as well. So I would like to actually compare between these two because they are somewhat similar in that they somehow model some kind of bureaucratic cost associated with some action, right? Action or change. Both of these feel more arbitrary or far more removed than real life compared to, say, money, which you can more easily accept as a very reasonable abstraction of how money actually worked back then. And so the criticism is maybe like arbitrary, or rather more arbitrary. All things are in the end arbitrary, but it feels more arbitrary. And the evidence I have for that is that it's further removed from real, maybe real costs or real currency or real resources. And I should criticize the criticism. This isn't bad on its own. This isn't necessarily bad. You can have a lot of interesting strategy games that make very wide abstractions. Like chess is an example, where they're abstracting so much about, is it warfare? Conflict? Some kind of armed conflict between two parties, right? And you can still have a very enjoyable and deep game without modeling everything precisely. Okay? And, in the end, these kinds of things are necessary at some level to make things more tangible, both to develop, but also to play/learn. But sort of related to this, so I'm not going to make it a second criticism. It's sort of like a 1.5, is that it's vague, okay? This is especially true of Monarch points. We're sort of forced into this arguably past relic of this trichotomy between admin, dip, mill. Everything is, they make an effort to try to categorize everything in EU4 into one of these categories. And so anything that can remotely resemble, okay, one of these are sort of forced into this category. One common example that people complain about is culture conversion. People argue that, hey, maybe it should involve some military. People say, no, it's not military, it's very peaceful, right? Maybe. And it's not all obvious. Well, it's just a balancing thing, I think, but it's not obvious why naval things belong in dip, right? I think it's more of a military thing, but it's probably like a balance thing. They probably intended land armies, the cost involving land armies, to be handled by this mill category. But the problem with this vagueness is that, and sort of forced trichotomy, is that whenever it doesn't sort of scale itself to content creep. And that's my second criticism. So maybe this really belongs here. I don't know. So I want to say doesn't scale. And this is the second major topic that I want to talk about. Content creep, scaling, and balance. So it's not at all, a surprise to say that EU4 has been going on this trend of content creep, power creep, mission creep, and so on. This isn't a necessarily bad thing. Yeah, I actually don't think power creep isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it's probably a very economically viable option for them because in the end, people like getting flashy numbers and flashy modifiers and seem powerful. And being more powerful than past patches is one sort of easy way to feel good for a lot of people. But the nature of the whole new editions of content is that more things start being associated with mana. And mana has always been intended to be relatively balanced across any country. There is, unless you're a horde or using some kind of trick that gives you a lot of Monarch point generation, there's a monthly cap on how many Monarch points you can get. Right? And no matter how big or powerful you are, you can never beat that cap. On the other hand, no matter how poor you are, you're going to make a certain base amount of Monarch points. And the gap isn't as high as, say, money, right? And OPM makes like significantly less, like even thousands times less money than a really big nation with a good economy. You don't get that kind of discrepancy with Monarch points. So somehow I think there's some intent to balance mana roughly. They still expect big nations or strong nations to have more Monarch points, right? You can get more Monarch points through advisors, which is a way to convert money into Monarch points. You can get better rulers, which requires prestige. And this isn't, I mean, I would personally say this is not true. But at the very least, I think in terms of easiness or how the game is sort of rigged towards, the stronger you are as a country, the easier it tends to be to cap on prestige and therefore use it to freely disinherit rulers for better air stats, right? So with that in mind, new content tends to bring more things that interact with mana. By the way, why is that? This is because mana is vague, or this is often because mana is vague. Okay, so if you have a shiny new button, okay, it can very easily relate to mana. And in my opinion, it sort of promotes lazy and a lazy out for developers. Instead of thinking how this modifier or this fancy thing that they added interacts with other parts of the game, they can immediately just say, oh, it interacts with Monarch points. It costs mana or it gives mana. Because mana somehow is an abstraction that's very vague. Okay? And so I think the trend is that over time there are more Monarch point sources. Actually, I should say effective Monarch point sources, or mana sources, sorry. I shouldn't use MP. Mana sources. I'll talk about what this effective means, but even if you ignore this caveat that I'm going to talk about, you have hordes that can raise, which didn't exist before. I mean, hordes have been around for a while. And in 1.26, I think? No, 1.24, Mandate of Heaven, they added Shogun, right? Which gives Shogun ways to gain more Monarch points through Force Seppuku. Similarly, Tribs give more Monarch points. Various mission rewards give at least one time Monarch points, and so on, right? So, over time, I would say the trend is that we've been gaining more Monarch points. Okay? On the other hand, I think when it comes to ways to spend Monarch points, okay, there haven't really been much of a change. And this is actually a very difficult problem that I'll talk about. This idea of balancing sources versus sinks. Okay? And so, going back to this idea that there's some kind of balance, intended balance, involved in Monarch points. I want to just quickly go back to reform progress, because I think reform progress is also similarly vague as monarch points, mana. I think you can very easily replace anything that costs reform progress with admin, and at least ignoring game balance and all that, you can at least nod that it kind of makes sense. And similarly, I think you can replace a lot of things that cost monarch points and replace it with reform progress. And at least conceptually nod that it kind of makes sense. Like, for example, filling out an idea, kind of like changing stuff and policies in your country. Hey, that feels like reform progress is a suitable abstraction for it, right? Yet, people don't complain too much about reform progress. One obvious reason is that it just has a much lower presence in the game. You can get by EU4 without interacting with reform progress that much compared to mana. But if you throw out all the reform farming tricks, so this is not a bullet point, this is a minus, like, throw it out. Minus. If you ignore reform farming tricks that have always existed that let you get arbitrary amounts of reform points, in general, the effective reform progress generation has been in check. Oops. What I mean, really, is that you don't have as much of an unbalance as, say, hordes with monarch points compared to normal countries. Okay? And reform progress, I think, is more focused. Or rather, it's more consistently applied, I think. Like, anything that relates to government reforms uses reform progress. Now, there have been some additions to make reform progress mean other things. Like, you can spend reform progress to gain governing capacity, or centralizing state, I believe, costs reform progress and admin now. I'm not too familiar with it because I never use it. And I think these 2 points, okay, make reform progress feel sort of innocent. For a lot of people who might be opposed to monarch points. Even though, really, I think they're very similar at a fundamental level in what they sort of try to abstract. Okay? So, just as a thought experiment, suppose if hordes can raise reform progress. You can always BS your way through why this makes sense, because reform progress is a very vague thing. Maybe you kidnap competent government bureaucrats and make them work for you, and somehow that gives you more capacity to make government-related changes. You can make up some kind of BS reason why it makes sense and try to convince yourself that, like, sure, at least at a surface level, this seems like a fine thing to do. But then imagine the implications of it, and I think more people would be opposed to reform progress. So really, I think what keeps reform progress in check is that this effective reform progress generation has sort of been controlled over the past patches. That's not to say that it's always the same for any country, right? Being, in quote, tall, i.e. having low average autonomy, tends to, or does, help your reform progress generation. Being a republic also helps as well, although this is somewhat balanced by the fact that going from a republic to another government reform loses more reform tiers than, say, going from a monarchy to another government type. So now that we're talking about balance, I'll probably pitch in a bit on how we could even attempt to balance mana. So this is section 3, I guess. And the first important question we should ask is, should we? Do we care? And I think even at this point, a lot of people will be split. Some people think it's fine, whereas some people don't, because having more Monarch point sources lets you interact with more flashy and shiny things in the game, and that can be fun in its own way. And similarly, if you sort of balance it too much, you curb Monarch point sources and try to standardize across nations and builds, then you kind of sort of lose identities that countries can have, which I think is a very appealing part of the game for a lot of people. Countries have various kinds of identities, and it's a very fine balance. On the other hand, you have hordes, right? Which I think a lot of people would agree makes way too many Monarch points. Even then, if people propose nerfing hordes, I think some people would be violently against it. I personally don't have any stakes in the matter. If hordes are gutted to the ground, that's just how it is. But I've heard arguments. I don't necessarily agree with these arguments, but I don't think they're particularly bad arguments per se. Is that hordes take skill or whatever, right? And I mean, it is true to like truly abuse the Monarch points that hordes get. You really do need to play EU4 in a different way compared to other countries. So this question of should we balance mana, is this even something we should go for, is already a controversial topic, I think. But whatever side you're on, it's still fun, at least for me, to talk about how we could do it. So first, I want to address this whole effective adjective that I've been adding to both Monarch point mana generation and reform progress generation. So when I say effective, I mean mana generation modified by reductive or by reductions to mana cost of certain interactions. And I guess I'll just illustrate with an example, then I think it'll be absolutely clear, is that suppose I spend 50% of my Monarch points in coring, of my admin points in coring, and I guess 50 for the rest. Maybe I shouldn't use slash, because I tend to use slash for same as above. And suppose my CCR is 0, and my all power cost is 0, and my admin efficiency is 0. Basically, I'm paying full coring costs. Okay, then if I were to say go from 0% to, so this is with 0% CCR. Let's suppose I go to 50% CCR. Well, then I'd be spending 25% coring, 50% blah, and I'll have 25% left over. So I could either spend this to core more things, or if I'm somehow maintaining this ratio, then it'll be 1/3 coring and 2/6 blah. Did I say 2/6? I meant 2/3. So the point is, but let's go back to this global perspective. The point is, I've sort of, in quote, gained, again, in quote, gained 25% of my overall overall admin points by this reduction. That is to say, I went from what did I go from? I've yeah. Is it, wait. Oh boy. Yeah, I think it's fair to say from this state, I've effectively multiplied my admin point generation over the course of the game by 1.25. As a more severe example, if I spend 50-50 and I go from 0 to 80%, then I've multiplied my Monarch point generation by 2.5, is that right? Oh, I should have prepared by doing the math. Sorry, my head's hurting. I'm not very good at mental math, as you can tell. But this is what I mean by effective mana generation. And going back to reform progress, why I said effective reform progress is controlled. One thing Paradox didn't do, which I'm kind of surprised by the way, is that they haven't added any reduction modifiers to reform progress cost. Like imagine if instead of a reform costing 100, it costs 80, like you have a 20% reduction modifier. Then that can serve as a multiplier on your effective reform progress generation, because that's really all you use your reform progress for, roughly, right? So, new content, i.e. new missions. Let's be real. When we say content, we just mean missions nowadays. Missions and events. And monuments, I guess. Is that they tend to add more reductions to modifiers. Stab cost, CCR, whatever. And a whole lot of them involve reductions to things that cost Monarch points. So this increases effective mana generation compared to prior patches, because you spend less, or you need to spend less to achieve the same. And so modifier stacking should be curbed, really, because these are multipliers to your Monarch point generation, so they're pretty powerful in their effect. So one way to fix this is, as I said, we have to tackle the problem, or if we consider a problem. Some people won't consider a problem. I'm like, whatever with it. The recurring theme is that I don't really care about these things. I have a fairly neutral stance on everything, and I'll just take what I get. But one way to solve this is to tackle the problem of modifier stacking, as I mentioned. And I think modifier stacking deserves its own podcast / yapcast on its own. But here are two ways in which one can curb this problem. This isn't at all like innovative, by the way. Oh, sorry, I should have said inno in my video. Oops. Well, this is like a very naive solution, but one solution is to make reductive modifiers stack multiplicatively. I think this is a fairly common solution to deal with this problem. So as an example, if you have a 25% CCR reduction, the R actually is already reduction. So I just pulled what's called a redundant acronym syndrome, or like ATM machine. So CCR. If I have 25% CCR and I add another 25% CCR on it, in the current system, they just add. I get a 50% CCR. If you look at it in terms of the multiplier to cost, at 25%, I pay 75% of the total cost. Okay, if I add on another 25%, I pay a 50%, and so on. If it's multiplicatively, okay, so this is the multiplicative version, the one I'm proposing, is, well, you start with 75, okay, and then it's, well, 3/4 times 3/4, 75% times 75%, which is, what, 9/16, which is like 0.56 roughly. I don't know. And this one is 27 over 64, which is 0.4 something, 0.4445, something around that range. So the point is that as you keep stacking it, if you look at it in terms of the overall multiplier, the sort of the rate in which it reduces diminishes. Maybe that's a very convoluted way to state it, but you can just see it for yourself, right? The effects of stacking is sort of less impactful in this setup. So that's one way. Another way is to just like limit the ways in which you can acquire modifiers. One way is like quite literally go to the files and cut CCR across every modifier. Probably not a preferred option, because that means that if you want to do anything reasonable, you're kind of forced to tag switch a bunch. But you could even limit the tag switching on its own. Maybe permanent modifiers disappear upon tag switching, or maybe permanent modifiers switch to temporary modifiers for like 10 years or something upon switching. You can come up with various kinds of variations to fit your needs. But yeah, the other way is to just try to limit the way we can acquire these kinds of modifiers and stack them. Okay. So I'm not saying we should do any of them. I'm just saying that these would sort of be one kind of limitation we can impose to make effective mana generation robust with respect to new content that inevitably adds more power creep. Well, it wouldn't be power creep in this scenario if these things are curbed, I guess. Another way, this might be a hot take. This is just something I kind of cooked. So this is straight from the oven. Is you redefine what it means to be balanced. Now, typically when we say something is balanced in the context of this conversation, we're trying to compare to past patches and like comparing countries one to one, right? Like you might say France in 1.blah is weaker than France on the modern patch because blah, blah, blah. They have missions that give this kind of modifier. They have missions that give this kind of claim, whatever, right? And in the context of, specifically in the context of Monarch points, if you compare to past patches, you can sort of look at this effective Monarch point generation by how many modifiers you can kind of stack, and also how many new sources of Monarch points there are. 1 second. And so that's the, I think, intuitive way to think about balance. A radical shift in perspective is to ignore balance across patches. And for the record, I'm not saying this is a good thing. I haven't even given time to fully develop it. It's just a little thought experiment that sort of lingered in my brain, and I want to try to sketch it out and see if I can convey it. But here goes. So this idea came from a fairly basic realization I had, that the other way to curb this whole problem of mana generation is to increase mana cost. I'm not saying you go around and increase the base cost of coring. That would be a very unpopular change. I'm saying we should add more ways to use mana, so add more mana sinks. Now, this on its own doesn't work. Why is that? Because if the mana sinks are worth it, are worth, maybe I'll say, using, then what'll happen is that, sure, you're going to spend Monarch points in other ways, but you're going to get a stronger game state because of it. And that seems to go against the whole type of balancing that we had in mind across patches. And the other option is to make mana sinks not worth using, in which case nothing happens, aside from effective Monarch point generation going up, because people just won't interact with that mechanic. And that's also a bad thing. So if you want to make this mechanic worth using, you either have to forego this idea of cross-patch balance and accept that you're going to get more out of your country from the same resources across patches. Or you do another route, which is that you can force certain mana sinks to be used, in which case you don't have to talk about balance. The most naive example of that is every year you're like deducted 50 admin points just from an event. Now that's a horrible way to do it, but that would curb it, right? So out of sort of process of elimination, I want to actually go into the case where you make mana sinks that are worth using, and you don't force it. So then naturally you're going to get a stronger country. But what I mean by that is, suppose I have some hypothetical country. Hopefully ZZZ is not a valid tag. Oh shit, I'm sleepy. YYY is not a valid tag. If it is, then well, that's awkward. But I mean to be talking about some arbitrary tag. And over the course of some representative campaign, I'm going to have a breakdown of let's just stick with admin. You can repeat this for dip and mill, but you're going to have this breakdown of, you know, how much you spend, right, to how much Monarch point, admin points you spend, A sub 1 all the way to A sub n, to what particular conversion, A sub capital A1 to capital AN. As an example, you know, A1 might be coring, and little a1 might be 30%. I use 30% of my admin points to, this is post modifiers, to core. Now what'll happen is that in the presence of power creep, okay, so ignoring the whole sync part, we're just sort of focusing on this idea that effective mana generation increases. What'll happen is that for this tag, the breakdown will be like A1 times some small multiplier, let's call it B1, and so on. I mean, not all patches will interact with every single way to spend Monarch points. This should be Bn. Okay, and the point of this is this B is always going to be less than 1. So it's always going to reduce things. Again, this doesn't necessarily happen. I mean, some patches can increase the cost of things. But what this means is that summing these up no longer add to 1, right? Because this previously added to 1, or 100%. And this will sum up to some numbers lower than 100%. Just to start with, let's just say it adds up to 80%, right? Then so you have 20% of your Monarch points to do something with. If you don't add mana sinks, these 20% will be redistributed somewhere. Maybe you core more, or maybe you just dev push more. That's how it typically works nowadays. Now, if you add more mana sinks, ideally, this 20% gets used for new actions that you've sort of introduced in this patch. And if you do that, then you still maintain this ratio of how many points you used for a certain for a certain action. So this is still something I'm thinking about. Like, what are reasonable mana sinks in this case? Off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything. But I do think there's some kind of design space that this kind of produces. But I'm not a game developer, so I don't know. But I do think this idea is promising. I don't I'm neither experienced enough nor interested enough to develop this idea further. But I think it'll be cool to think about the idea of balancing Monarch points in this particular way. But again, to go back, all of this is predicated on if we actually care about balancing mana points, and also predicated on how we care about balancing mana points. Like in these examples, I assume that we care about balance in the sense of some notion of country strength. In this one, I cared about more in the sense of exact amount of interactions you perform. I don't know which way is the right way. I think this first one is the obvious way and the non-controversial way if you care about it. But I'm very curious how this works, this idea. So, okay. So I have a bit more time. So, well, I always have time, I guess. So, I want to talk about Imperator Rome for a sec. Because Imperator Rome, on release, had 4 Monarch points. And nowadays, supposedly have 0, which is absolutely not true. Well, actually, I don't know if it's supposedly have 0, but the claim is that they removed Monarch points. So I suppose right now the claim is they have 0, even though I don't think that's true at all. Like, political influence, if you know Imperator, is really mana. So let me talk a bit about this change, because I've actually played Imperator Rome on release. So I've experienced this, and I've experienced this. But I've only experienced this a bit, and I've only experienced this slightly more than a bit plus. And I should acknowledge, Lambert, who asked a few questions about the sanity check, what I want to talk about here. But as I mentioned, Imperator Rome used to have 4 kinds of mana, and it sort of tried this, is this a word? Quad-cotomy? Well, if it's a word, you don't need this hyphen. If it's not a word, then I suppose you need this hyphen. Actually, cotomy isn't a word, so this isn't a word, I guess. But you get the idea. They try to associate various kinds of actions and themes in this game to one of these 4 categories. Now, I forgot what they're called, but like you had one that was effectively mill swords. You had one that was religion. You had one that was culture. And you had one that I don't really know how to describe. So here are some ways in which you can... Actually, I want to focus on 2 ways in which you can use mana to control pops. So for people who don't know, Imperator Rome provinces have pops. So think of EU4 province. Actually, in Imperator Rome, these aren't called provinces. These are called territories? I forgot. But anyway, the smallest unit of land in Imperator Rome. Each of them have various kinds of pops. How should I write them? So like, think of this as a sample province. It has 3 units of the citizen pop. Oh, I don't know the order off the top of my head. This is what, freeman, and this is slave or something like that. And this will be tribal man or something like that. I don't know the order, and the exact details aren't important. The point is that they abstract development in EU4 differently based on pops. Now, these pops are too fine-grained. I mean, like a big city might have like 20 to 30 populations. You can, of course, get way more if you stack food and various modifiers. But so you can roughly think of 1 dev equals 1 pop. Roughly, okay? Just to give you an idea for people who don't know. And what would one way to use one of these 4 manas is that for each pop, they would have some religion, some culture, okay? And you could pay Monarch points to convert their religion and culture instantaneously. There were a ton of other ways to use Monarch points, by the way, but this was one way to use Monarch points. And I should also talk about so that's a mana sink that I want to talk about, and the mana source, is, I believe, only ruler stats. Only, I think. Like, there's no base gain like in EU4, and there's no advisors, I think. Could be wrong. But I do recall that it was very frustrating because the variance was even higher than in EU4. Because there weren't too many systems to interact with the ruler system, at least as far as I'm aware of. Maybe there are, and I'm just skill issued. But this sort of high variance mana source, I think, also added to this issue. But yeah, the issue, I think, was that, at least in the context here, is that you can pay Monarch points to sort of get instantaneous effects that were fairly strong and also felt very gamey. And so in the process of, in quote, removing mana, they've had to think about these actions more. They had to think about how we replace these conversions, because conversions still had to exist. Well, I guess they could have technically removed conversions entirely, but that would be problematic too, because that feels very weird that pops never convert. So the way they replaced it is they made a more granular system. So basically, post the mana removal, pops would gradually be converted. So there would be like some sort of progress bar. I think it was a wheel, I forgot. Or no, was it a wheel? I don't know, but there's some kind of way to see progress. And you'll see like, oh, we're like this % way of the done to convert this citizen to our right religion. Same idea for culture. Okay, and now the speed in which this conversion occurred was dependent on a lot of things, like countrywide policies. And here I mean policies in a very abstract sense, not in the literal sense. Yeah, like we had policies that I think affected conversion, I think. But we also had like tech or inventions. What kind of inventions you go for. In EU4 terms, think of these as ideas. Or tech was a tree in Imperator Rome, so you were more flexible with what kind of modifiers you go for. You can spend money to influence the conversion by buildings. So you can kind of see that, oh, and the other way you can use money is that you can move slaves around to change the dominant culture or ancestral religion in a particular province, and which would also affect conversion rate. So they've turned this very simplistic system and abstraction of conversion with a more granular, maybe, system that interacts in complicated ways with a lot of things. And I think this was received positively. So this is an example of removing mana in quotes done right. Now, what if it was done wrong? Well, one way to do it wrong is make this cost money, right? Then you arrive at the same exact problem. Okay, so I think I've talked enough. So let me try to summarize. So what I want to get at is that mana is a currency, like money or manpower. Okay. And because of its vagueness, it serves as a sort of catch-all for interactions with new content, because you can always BS your way through why it makes sense that this interaction, new fancy button, has to interact with Monarch points, because it's such a vague vague currency. So it tends to serve as a catch-all. And this IMO promotes lazy design, because instead of thinking about how your new fancy thing affects the game as a whole, you can instead get away with, maybe not get away, but you can instead sort of BS your way by letting mana take the blame, right? You can say, oh, this costs admin points, without sort of thinking about the ramifications of it in terms of mana economy in the game. So I think really this thing needs to be done with more care in general. And the idea of just remove mana is not so simple, because what you're really doing is you're just removing a way in which a currency can be used. Or maybe you're removing all ways in which a currency can be used, if you're outright removing it in the literal sense. And the problem is that for every interaction, you have to think, right? For every interaction that you remove, you need to do something about it. You can either, just remove it and let it die. You can adjust costs, right? Make it cost something else like money, manpower, or whatever. Or you can rework the system. And I think people tend to imply that they want this. And furthermore, they probably want it more complex. Again, complexity on its own isn't necessarily a good thing. But I think that's what a lot of people imply. And whether it's complex or not, this rework can be good or bad, right? Or both, I guess. Nothing is uncontroversially good or uncontroversially bad. Okay, maybe some things are uncontroversially bad, but it'll be opinionated. So I guess what I want to say is that removing mana requires a lot of care. And it's a very hard thing to do, I think. And I'm not even sure if it's really the right thing to do. As I said, like, abstractions are necessary at some level. And I would personally think that balancing mana economy can go a long way into making mana feel better for the people who criticize the current mana as is in EU4. All right.